Greetings, BookTube. This is ML Clark coming to you with Better Worlds Theory YouTube edition. I'm joined as always by my special guest, The Highway. Although all the fun on it was this morning for Semana Santa, this is the Sunday of Semana Santa, and we already had the lovely parades. So I'm sorry, those background noises will not be on this recording. I'm still in the process of trying to figure out which of my personal projects I can keep and how I can continue to manage as a writer myself while transitioning into a more formal capacity with respect to writer advocacy and outreach. I'm doing quite a bit of work, a full-time position, but it hasn't quite been announced yet, so I can't say more than that. I will say that because it's still in that limbo mode, it's been tough to try to figure out how to balance all of these other projects. And so I apologize for the inconsistency therein. I'm hoping it's moving towards something better. We shall see. Today, we are going to be looking at an issue of Clarkesworld, February 2025. It has one of my stories in it, but I think everyone here knows me well enough by now to know that I am really much more interested in how the curation works and talking about how stories fit together and how stories live in tension with one another, talking too about how fellow writers are engaging with themes and concepts that have been consistent in science fiction writing for a while, but with variations that emerge because of the specific author and context in which they are employed. So you get to see how things change and how a similar concept is sometimes seen through different lenses. That's definitely the case here. Many of these stories work so beautifully together, and that they really do deserve paired readings so that you can more fully flesh out that theme. Unfortunately, in our industry, there is still sometimes the push for individual uplift at cost to the group. Not everywhere. There are many of us, I think, who are excited to talk about the work around us and to talk specifically about how science fiction lives in community. But as always, I'm going to try to introduce you to some of these stories so that you can decide to read them on your own. But I also just recommend, I'd love just diving through a full issue. And I love the fact that sometimes having my own work in a publication gives me extra excuse to look at everyone else in the table of contents and uplift and celebrate them too. So, as always, we start with the art, which not everyone is going to be able to enjoy, but I do think Clarkesworld does a phenomenal job in really setting a scene. And I've talked in the past about how science fiction has this sort of tension. Often, a lot of science fiction has a tension between three concepts. One is our sense of self, personal human intelligence. What is it? What are our capacities? The broader natural intelligences of the world or universe, so other biological life forms in various capacities, and artificial intelligence of a more mechanical nature. So the intersections between these three tend to create a body of anxieties that science fiction is quite well suited to explore. This cover does not have much of nature, but it still has a lovely tension. And I think if you look at Hamish Frater's deploying for a mission, you'll see that this love of classic mechanical bodies, as he's described in the bio, has manifested in different units that can be put to work by humans, clearly are made for humans to be operating. And in fact, there is a little human on the side as these giant mech units are being loaded onto a transport. But you, as the viewer, get to decide what kind of work they might be doing. There are affectations in the design that suggest there might be a security function. Is it a defense function? Is it an offense function? And there are also elements that suggest that it might be more of an exploratory and investigative and scientific function. And that tension, I think, is really nice in this piece. It allows you to think about the capacity for the mechanic, whether it is a material form or something artificial like a corporate construct. It is a tool, and we get to interpret whether it is going to be a violent or oppressive one, or if it's something useful. So keep that in mind as we go through the stories for this issue. Again, there are two reading orders possible depending on how your page is set up. Because if you have a two-column format, you're going to read things in one column and then the other, and that'll be a different reading order than if you're on your phone or a one-column layout. So I am not picking favorites. I just happen to have a certain reading order each time. and this one was the two column layout. So the first story in this piece is by Rocío Vega. It's been translated by Sue Burke. It's called Bodyhoppers. And I will just leave one tiny note with caution when it comes to the translation. It's not a criticism, but it is something that I tend to note because I speak and move in both languages. Spanish will use present simple more often than in English. And sometimes when people are translating, they can choose to translate a little bit more literally. And as a result, it can sometimes read a little bit awkwardly on the page just because it's not uh, quite as intuitively written in the same way that we would use verb tenses in English. This is just part of the process. There are choices always made in translation, but it's not an error. It's just a choice to be extremely literal in some of the translation of verb tenses here. So, just a little cautionary note for pieces that are translated from other languages, I can't always help, but for this one, I can. And so in this story, Bodyhoppers, we encounter somebody who has just essentially downloaded themselves into a body, and we are waking with them, understanding why, and the reasons underlying this choice have to do with a really difficult position that certain consciousnesses are placed in by systems that have promised them a better world, sort of post singularity, where they can upload themselves and just live so much better, and in the process, free up their bodies probably to be able to help with the cost of living. It starts us in a position, first and foremost, a little bit of empathy for the character, then moving to a position of concern because they are, in fact, stealing somebody else's body. And that continues to be an abiding issue in this. But as the story grows, the complexity of the position that the protagonist is in becomes clear. It doesn't take away from the gravity of what they've done and the harm that they might have caused to another, uh, but you do fully understand by the story's end that just desperate struggle to survive, to be present, to rebuild is created by something larger than the individual. They can be culpable, and larger systems can also be culpable for the actions that they take. So the desperation is very human, and the constructs that we build around it of who's a pirate, who's a thief, who is really the one exploiting others, just becomes murky as the story goes forward. So that's Bodyhoppers. The next story by Somto Ihezue is called We Begin Where Infinity Ends. And this is probably the sweetest story in this issue. It's this lovely look at the idyllic nature of childhood when it comes to trying to make change in a world that is clearly filled with so many different messes. There's so much broken and wrong that requires people to be moving about and trying to do what they can. And here we have three children who are bound together by a very simple dream to try to get fireflies to return by reducing light pollution through the use of a filter technology that Gozi has dreamed up and that Naeto, the engineer among them, is developing, along with River, a young girl who is also interested in and supports the project. These three children will create a sort of wave of public interest, and the project will have a life of its own. But in the middle of that, there are also emotional elements of being a child, especially as Naoto really comes to understand why he does the work that he does and his feelings with respect to the two people around him. And at the same time, he's still a child. And so, a little bit like the fireflies themselves, these children live in this bright moment of possibility and potential, and then it all falls apart. But then maybe, again, the light can come back. So, the story is a gentle kind of optimism. It's fascinating too because the story also thinks one problem further down the line, which is really nice. In many parts of sub Saharan Africa, especially, lighting projects are extremely important to human uplift. The idea of trying to get electricity into certain areas and light into regions of Africa is about empowering people, creating more economic capacity, allowing people to go to school longer, work longer, build more for their families. And so, right now, the major project we have is onboarding all of that light technology. But Somto here has thought a couple moves down the line, once we have that light technology, it could easily erode the surrounding ecosystems, and then we're going to need to come up with fixes for that too. So it's a really clever use of science fictional concepts in a light way, nothing really extravagant with respect to the technology, but really thinking about future problems caused by the way that we are handling current crises. And again, as I said, it is the sweetest of the stories. There is a sort of positive ending for all the characters involved, gentler than life often allows, but earned in the way that Somto has definitely called attention to the hardships that exist for these characters first. The next piece by Wang Zhenzhen, translated by Carmen Yiling, is called The Hanging Tower of Babel. And this piece pairs beautifully with another one. This, in conjunction with the next story I'm going to talk about, are two really interesting reflections on a similar theme. We've got generational thoughts about the parent's legacy and how it impacts the child, and what goes forward from the interactions between the two. So we are given an understanding of Zhang Haoyu, who gave his life to a space project called the Stairway to Heaven. It was this grand space initiative, and while it was in the height, he was hero for his country in many ways, but estranged from his family because he'd spend 10 months every year really much at a remove from his family and missing key components in childhood, life and death struggles. And as a result, the family itself has a bit of a mixed association with him, despite the fact that he, for a while, is considered to be this stellar, pun intended, I suppose, figure. Unfortunately, the project leads to the space travelers gaining Alzheimer's at a much more accelerated rate. So it's essentially shut down. Essentially, space travel becomes less of an interesting point of pride for the country. And so the country is moving in a propagandist way to try to dismantle it and disavow everything that came before. So all of that grandeur that he had poured himself into is also disappearing, just like his memory. And we're experiencing this through the adult child, reflecting on that experience for his father and for himself, and all of the impacts for both of them along the way, and the rest of their family too. So it is a piece that's very wisely looking at not just the idea of space and estrangement, but also what happens when the whole concept belongs to a period and the period comes to an end. That has a powerful tie into, I think, some of the things we're living through right now as well. But I'll leave that aspect aside and just say that reading this story and then Claire and Jia-Wen's Celestial Migrations was beautiful, because this is another story about generational cost. So in the backdrop, we have this lovely concept of this annual migration of celestial manta rays, and this movement invites a lot of study, research, and opportunities for rituals of coming together among humans as well. And we have two sides of human migration: these parents who have sacrificed so very much to have and then support a child, and they lived under really arduous circumstances, compromised a tremendous amount. And the hard part is they don't quite realize this. They look forward to, they ache for the opportunity to see that child living a better life a few days every year. But that too, that migration for that child is something that takes away from the child being fully able to escape the system of poverty, the system of oppression that the parents desperately want the child to. So the child is trying to do everything right, but they see the system from a different way. And yet, how can they deny their parents, who have sacrificed everything to get them as far as they did, that one little bit of joy that allows the father to be able to endure all kinds of hard working conditions for the rest of the year? So it's this beautiful meditation again on these sacrifices, the distance between generations, the distance between understanding in generations, and the systems, the broader state apparatuses in the first story, and I guess galactic apparatuses in the second story, that just make it so hard for people to make better choices, to be present with family, even though there's a lot of love. The next story, though, again goes back to that concept I presented with the cover, where you get to decide what kind of society, what kind of mechanized system you're moving through. And that very much comes through in Fiona Moore's King of the Castle, where we have Fergal, a past leader of a band of thugs. He's moved into a community that has just decided to find ways to live without laws or system of justice in that kind of sense. They're very much slightly like a kind of anarchist society. They don't use that term specifically, but this is a way in which anarchist societies can run, mutual aid, mutual uplift, and looking for solutions within the community. There are vestiges of old technology among them, including a robot called Seamus, who has some protective capacities that tend to be very useful. But in general, the community is living in an era in the near future where a lot of things that we have relied upon, our whole era of internet technologies and all the fancy gadgets that we currently rely on, is just fading. And so Seamus is part of that old order, and in some ways Fergal is too, but he hasn't quite figured it out. So this community is trying to figure out, okay, well, we've got this person who's moved into this old mansion that's fallen apart, and he's rebuilding systems and creating violence in our community again. There's got to be some way to try to figure out how to coexist, um, or or ask him to leave and to make it very hard for him to see any sense of community here at all. And so this group tries, and they try in one way in particular by encouraging him to take up sports coaching so he has something that he can do. But the behavior set just will not align itself with the community. And in a very soft way, the community finds its opportunities to distance itself, even though this person is trying so hard to assert their will through violence. A community that is committed to making other choices will find ways to just edge a person like that out so they can find another place where they might better fit in. So again, when we have this issue that has a lot of examples of systems that exploit and cause harm, from Bodyhoppers to the Hanging Tower of Babel, although that one might not be so much, it does cause harm, but it's going through these grand movements. And then celestial migrations, there's just this background economic suffering, which I guess then leads to my story, which fits beautifully in this issue, I have to say. I think mine might be the most cynical of all of them. If I mentioned that We Begin Where Infinity Ends is definitely the sweetest, mine is just absolutely shrouded in grief and cynicism. It follows a crew that usually goes to explore and check out new phenomenon, new planets, and so forth, possibly for colonization, investigation, exploration. Really, when I designed or thought about this concept, it's part of a council that had an original mission that was much loftier, a little bit like Zhenzhen's work, but over time it's just been infused by so much corporate interference and selfishness and superficiality that the original mission has very much fallen apart. So this crew has discovered a world that was supposed to be super easy. It's lush. It's prime for colonization. Doesn't really need many changes. It's already pretty well adapted to human needs, and yet it has this mysterious alien site on it. And by that I mean that there is another species that has dropped signs of its existence on this world, and it is a kind of first contact, except that there are no living aliens there to talk to. So we have this archaeological site, which requires care, it requires scientific exploration, and yet under this changed parameter set for their overarching organization, they're not going to get scientists coming to explore. They are probably the only ones who are going to be able to, with care, assess the site, and it's just not going to be enough to figure out its mysteries, because essentially their council has been overrun by a corporate figure who has decided to sell off access to this world to the highest bidder. And there are some superficial religious spectacles that are making use of this opportunity, and they're going to colonize it in the name of their franchise faiths, more or less. And so we have this crew just waiting for that awful result and trying to figure out, is there any way to stop this degradation of the mission? And in the meantime, they too are grieving a personal loss. They've lost a crew member just a little bit before. This means that they are holding in tension these very serious personal issues. They are holding in tension the desire for awe and wonder at the sight of something extraordinary and new, with the stupidity of the world that they are moving through. And if that sounds familiar to you, that's why I wrote this story. It took me a year and a half to write it properly. I did not write it well the first time, second time, third time, because I was trying to incorporate too much of what we're moving through with our personal struggles and our personal sense of what the mission of humanity was supposed to be, and just how much cruelty and destruction we're able to slip in. So much of what's supposed to be lofty has been lost to, at least for the moment, really cruel forces and self-serving forces. So mine is a very cynical story. That's a planet full of sorrows. Another story that's quite cleverly done, it's the last of the stories in this collection, is a short one. As I mentioned, Clarkesworld has these really great closing pieces. They're a little shorter usually than the rest, but they pack powerful punch. So Louise Inglis Hall's Numismatic Archetypes in the Year of Five Regents is a really clever look at an era of upheaval, a year in which there were five turnovers in terms of governing parties, if you can really call them governing, just the tyrant in charge, which again is interesting to read in contrast with Fiona Moore's King of the Castle too. But we're understanding this era through a coin collection as it has been archived at a later date, in contrast with a first-person account from one of the metalworkers. So that person lived through the actual year, and they had their own personal relationships, their own personal losses, a little bit like my story too. They're dealing with this personal trauma amid upheaval on a systemic level that's just absolutely frustrating. And so you get to see the difference between how history is recorded through an interpretation of the coins later on and how it was lived through in that moment. And really well done, just tightly done. And I just think a little over 3,000 words. Then we move into the nonfiction, which I always adore. And Kyle Tam's Rolling the Dice tabletop adaptations of speculative fiction was an interesting read for me. I went back and I read that a second time because it's written with a confidence from a person who clearly moves within this other medium to a level that I do not. And so there were allusions and references that didn't quite catch on the first read. The overarching story of the different kinds of forms of tabletop adaptations definitely could be followed, but there's just so much. The details were just really nice. Being able to go back and really closely examine some of what's been done. Essentially, Tam here has presented an understanding of how these universes work for everyday readers who might be a little bit confused by the fact that there is a lot of franchise branding, and yet a lot of what's done within the tabletop universe doesn't quite fit into a model of just following what the producer of the original product wanted. There's a lot of tension, there's a lot of play, there's a lot of reinterpretation. And so you get a really strong sense of just how rich and deep these creative universes are. I really recommend that one to learn a heck of a lot more about a really important and vital part of the science fiction fantasy universe. Then, of course, we have Arley Sorg. I absolutely adore these interviews. And I think I mentioned in the last piece that there was a shift toward editors that's continued here, but I really do like the way that Sorg has paired these two. We have Weird and Queer, a conversation with Dave Ring, and Special Arrangements, a conversation with Sean Markey. Now, Dave Ring, founder of Neon Hemlock, which is a publisher of novellas, and Baffling, a publication for other shorter weird stories. And then Sean Markey is the publisher for Psychopomp, which also again deals with novellas, and The Deadlands, which deals with other stories and nonfiction. And again, the range here is so useful because curation is different and how you structure publications is going to be different for those lengths. And there are obviously different pressure points in terms of the creation of viable platforms. But Neon Hemlock and Psychopomp have done a wonder in our industry, and not alone. There are a lot of small presses that are doing wonderful, fabulous, and I'm really just delighted that Sorg has decided to focus on them. So learn a little bit more about the mechanics of our industry, which again, oh yeah, I just am realizing that now pairs perfectly with the theme of this, because this does come back to those artificial systems. So just as the cover art leaves it to your imagination to decide whether the structures that we inhabit are for good or ill, that same question emerges in our industry, our publishing economy. These are two people who, with their teams, have created important structures to elevate writing in our genre, but they are doing so in relation to and in response to a lot of other difficult elements of industry. And that's the same for the tremendous number of stories in this issue. I'm trying to think if there's one that really doesn't quite fit the theme there. But no, I think they all really do have that lovely tied in feel that there are systems bigger than us. We have our griefs and our struggles within those systems. Even if it feels like we are consumed by the worst possible systems, they are still arbitrary constructs and they can be made in better ways. So, a very thoughtful issue, and an absolute delight. Lots of terrific paired readings here, and some really good thoughts on the structures of society that frame our sense of possibility. And I think that's about it today. Neil Clark's editorial is a little bit out of date now because I have taken a little bit too long to get to this. I was chuffed to see the 2024 Readers Poll finalists. I heartily approve of all of the folks on that list, but life has moved on since then. The poll closed February 15th, so we'll just circle back with another editorial at another time. Otherwise, I am just so thankful to everyone who engages in the work, whether it is writing and reading, hopefully, and reading broadly, reading around you, elevating the writers around you, or working in other capacities to support the structures that make industry possible. We require so much terrific curation, like we get from Neil Clark in Clarkesworld. And of course, this is also bolstered. I don't often talk about this, but I should, is that every issue, Kate Baker also lends her lovely voice to the audio versions of these stories, and that does give these stories another life and broadens audience share in tremendous ways. On top of that, as Arley Sorg's interviews point out, Arley Sorg is an interviewer as well as doing the work of Uplift, and the editors that he has been focusing on as of late should also remind readers that we are all working toward this vision of SFF together, and we are making it collaboratively. So whether our world is more like Fiona Moore's in King of the Castle, or if it goes through periods of upheaval as brutal and violent as the ones in Inglis Hall's story, Numismatic Archetypes in the Year of Five Regents, or even a slower rise and fall, such as you find with the Hanging Tower of Babel, it is still a group effort. And we ourselves are part of this sort of mechanical system of thought and creation, and how we decide to support that industry, what we decide to do to invest in it, is going to shape the world of science fiction and fantasy for many years ahead. So I look forward to seeing what everyone comes up with next. And until next time, whenever that is, this is ML Clark with Better Worlds Theory, YouTube edition. Cheers.